Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Larkin, and I'm the director of the Latino Latin American Studies program here at St. John's St. Ben's. And I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's talk on, which is the first talk that we're going to have of a series of 3 talks on the Latino Latin American Studies lecture series on Francis, the first Latin American Pope, for this semester. You can see that there are 2 more events coming up after tonight, right here, and you can look at those dates and times and put them into your schedule if you want to. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to give you a little bit of information on the Latino Latin American Studies program. Latino Latin American Studies program here at St. John's St. Ben's consists of 2 things. First and most importantly, it's an interdisciplinary minor that students can take here. It consists of 5 courses on either Latin American or Latino content issues. It has 2 required courses, both in Hispanic Studies 336 and 337. But then it consists of 3 electives that you can take from a variety of disciplines. For instance, I offer a number of courses on the history of Latin America and Mexico and religion in Latin America. You can also take courses in political science on Latin America or in global business in Latin America, and others as well, theology, of course, in Latin America, or Latino theology as well. If anybody is interested in or thinking about an interest in Latino Latin American studies and minoring in the program, I would really love to talk to you. If you would like more information, I have some brochures over on the table here, and you can just grab one, and my contact information is on there, and I'd really, really appreciate any interest that you may have in Latino Latin American studies. The other thing about Latino Latin American studies is that every semester we hold for lack of a better term, a lecture series around a particular theme. And of course, the theme for this semester is Francis, the first Latin American Pope. And every semester we also offer an opportunity to students to join a reading circle, in which interested students go to all of the lectures and then participate in discussions and do some extra reading about the issue that we're studying that semester. And students can register for this course either for 0 credits, and then you go to the 3 lectures, you do the reading, you come to the discussions, and that's it, or for 1 credit. And if you take the course for 1 credit, you then write a short 3 to 5 page reflection paper at the end of the semester about the experience of the lecture series. If anybody is interested in that, please come talk to me after the event. I would love to get you signed up for it. It's going to be a fun series this semester, as they always are, but this one will be particularly fun. So please come talk to me if you'd like to do that. Okay, now moving on to the topic of our series. So, as you probably know, on March 13th, 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Cardinal from Buenos Aires, Argentina, was elected the 266th Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. His election marked many firsts for the papacy. He was the first Jesuit Pope. He was the first Pope to take the name of one of Catholicism's most revered saints, Francis. And most important for our purposes tonight, he was the first Pope elected from Latin America. And this despite the fact that 40% of Catholics worldwide live in Latin America, which is more than in the United States, Canada, and Europe combined. Because of these many firsts, Francis's election generated much interest in the international press. But more important than that, his early actions as Pope generated and stirred even more excitement. He refused the traditional ornamental trappings of the papacy. He visited and comforted refugees and the poor. He condemned the excesses of free market capitalism. He issued an impassioned plea a little bit later on for the protection of the environment. He asked, "Who am I to judge?" And he called for a poor church for the poor. In this semester's lecture series, we're going to explore how Francis's Latin American background shaped who he was and who he became. And we're also going to explore how this man from Latin America is reshaping the universal church as Pope. And perhaps now and into the future, the orientation and stances of the church will better reflect the fact that 40% of Catholics come from Latin America. Our first lecture in the series begins this exploration by examining the recent social and religious history of Latin America. So it explores the context that shaped the young Francis, the Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and who he eventually would become. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Erika Helgen. She comes to us with a remarkably fine pedigree. She received her PhD in Latin American history with an emphasis on religious history and religious history in Brazil from Yale. She has a master's degree from Cambridge, and her undergraduate degree is from Harvard. Her dissertation is entitled Holy Wars, Protestants, Catholics, and the Struggle for Brazilian National Identity, 1921 through 1954. The title of her talk tonight, as you can see, is From Bergoglio to Francis, The History and Significance of Catholicism's First Latin American Pope. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Helgen to the podium.
Thank you. Okay, just a second. I'll set my timer so I don't go too long. Okay. Oh. There we are. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Larkin, for that great introduction. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I want to give a big thanks, as I just said, to Professor Larkin and to the Latino and Latin American Studies program for inviting me to speak tonight, and also really for putting together this wonderful lecture series. I'm so excited to attend the other lectures. Dr. Taylor's lecture coming up on liberation theology is going to be great. And I'd also like to thank the Collegeville Institute for hosting me as a postdoc scholar this year. It's been a great intellectual community there, and I found a great home. So tonight, as the subtitle of my talk suggests, I'm going to be talking about the history and significance of the first Latin American pope, which immediately prompts the question, what does it mean to be a Latin American pope, right? How has Pope Francis's leadership of the Universal Church been shaped by his experience in Latin America, and how, was and is Latin American Catholicism shaped by Pope Francis? And so those are, kind of the questions that I'm going to be looking at tonight. And I'm a historian, so I'm going to take a really historical approach to this question, looking at how the Catholic Church in Latin America developed and changed during the 20th century, and how those changes affected Pope Francis. And so the lecture is divided into 3 parts, just to give you a little bit of an idea of where I'm going. First, I'm going to talk about the emergence in the mid-20th century of a Latin American church, and what this is really the emergence of a Latin American ecclesial identity, in which this church defined itself as a church that was of and for the poor, so an iglesia de los pobres, and that had a prophetic voice that denounced injustice and repression throughout the continent. And then, to a certain extent, in what might feel like a little bit of a U-turn. I'm going to talk about the Catholic Church in Argentina, which has a history that in some really important ways diverges from much of the rest of Latin America, particularly in the area of social justice and human rights. The leadership of the Argentine church was very conservative, and it was one of the chief forces against many of the movements and reforms that I'm going to be speaking about in this first part of the lecture. Keep that in mind. And for fans of Pope Francis, which include myself, parts of this might be a little bit hard to hear. It's about Pope Francis and the Argentine church relationship with the military dictatorship in Argentina, which does not always paint the then Father Bergoglio in the greatest light, but I think it's important to address these issues because they formed part of this kind of broader conflict that was taking place in the Latin American church, and that would have a profound effect on Latin American ecclesial identity and the future Pope Francis. Speaking of Pope Francis, I'm going to end with a discussion of Pope Francis really as a Latin American pope leading a global church. So I'm going to look specifically at how the Francis we see today is a product of this 70-odd years of Latin American religious history that we're going to be covering in the first two parts of the lecture. So, that being said, the emergence of a Latin American church. And so what do we mean when we talk about a Latin American church? I'm going to start off with this quote from the final document of the 1968 Medellin Bishops' Conference. It says, "As Latin Americans, we share the history of our people. The past definitively identifies us as Latin Americans. The present places us in a decisive crossroads, and the future requires of us a creative labor in the process of development." So, on the surface, this doesn't really seem like an incredibly revelatory or groundbreaking statement. It's Latin American bishops saying, that they are indeed Latin American. But at the time, this actually was really a bold statement, an important statement of Latin American ecclesial identity. And it's the bishops saying that it wasn't their geographical location that defined them as particularly Latin American bishops, but rather their shared history and their common duty to engage with and develop their own community. And so this was actually a relatively new idea at the time. Now we don't think of it as necessarily very groundbreaking, but at the time this was kind of new because the Latin American Catholic Church didn't always think of itself as having a distinct identity or mission. For much of its history, really the sheer geographical size of Latin America, combined with underdeveloped transportation and communication networks, meant that Latin American national churches really operated in relative isolation from one another, with little sense of belonging to this kind of broader regional community. So instead of these horizontal relationships between Latin American churches, between Latin American bishops and priests and lay people, instead of these relationships, really the primary relationship was a vertical relationship between national churches in the Vatican, or in many cases in the 19th century, national churches and national governments, right, that had this sort of padroado, this control over their national churches. And these relationships dominated ecclesial life. Until, really the first initiatives to recognize and organize the Latin American church as a cohesive entity arose in the 19th century. But they didn't come from Latin American church leaders themselves, but they actually came from Rome, somewhat ironically, because they came about not because the Vatican really wanted to foster a sense of regional identity and pride in the Latin American church, but rather because Catholic leaders had come to see the Latin American church as a particular problem that they thought needed to be solved. In their mind, Latin American Catholicism, and particularly popular Catholicism and popular religiosity, the Catholicism of the everyday people, in their mind, this religion was backwards. It was this almost medieval Catholicism that was full of superstitions and unorthodox beliefs, and they thought that it was too heavily influenced by indigenous religions and African religions, right? In the history of Latin America, these are big influences, and so they didn't like that popular religious life, in many cases was led by lay people, not priests, in the form of these religious brotherhoods, popular devotions and shrines that were kind of outside the control of the priests. And ideally, they thought, it would be the Latin American priests who would kind of regain control of their parishes and sort of purify this popular Catholicism and guide their parishioners towards this more orthodox, which really was this kind of more European expression of religious devotion. But there was a problem with this solution, which was that church leaders also viewed Latin American priests as a very big part of the problem. Rather than the solution, they saw the priests as being, uneducated and lazy and immoral and worldly and unorthodox and lacking in respect for their ecclesiastical superiors. So one of the first targets of this reform project was what was come to be known as Romanization. And one of the first targets were the Latin American priests themselves. In 1858, what we see here, the Colegio Pío Latinoamericano was founded in Rome. The idea being that Rome, the Vatican would bring together the most promising seminarians throughout all of Latin America, and they would be brought together in Rome where they would receive this, Orthodox European formation, and then they would go back to their countries, right? And they would implement these reforms, and, thus they would purify their local churches. And, the graduates of this institution, of this Colegio Pío Latinoamericano, really became, the elite, the new elite of the Latin American church. These were the bishops, the archbishops, the cardinals were all coming from this institution. And again, the objective of the Vatican in doing this was really more to, increase Vatican control over Latin American churches, but it had this unintended consequence of strengthening relationships between Latin American leaders, right? Because they went to this college, they met each other, they formed relationships, and then they went back to their home countries, and they still had these relationships. Again, this is the 19th century, so it's kind of hard for them to travel and see each other, but they could keep in touch, and there was this kind of growing idea that, even if this identity was really based on having kind of this common problem that they needed to solve, it was still an identity. And this process would really only intensify in the years to come. So in 1899, you have the Latin American Plenary Council, also in Rome, which was the first time in history that Latin American bishops came together as a cohesive group, meeting one another and seeing themselves in regional terms as Latin American bishops. So, the next official gathering of Latin American church leaders would not take place for another 56 years, so there was a pretty big gap here. But when it did, it would be a big one. It would create a lasting institution that would have this very profound effect on the future of the Latin American church. The Consejo Episcopal Latinoamericano, also called CELAM. Again, like in the past, and this is sort of a pattern in Latin American church history, the groundbreaking nature of CELAM, what CELAM would become, was not what it was intended to be. It was really intended, there was this 1955, there was this 1955 conference, they came together, and it was really intended just to be kind of this very simple organizational body that would facilitate a more efficient implementation of, Vatican directives, basically. These kind of top-down vertical reform projects. But the mere creation of a permanent transnational leadership organization of the Latin American church that was based in Latin America, it was based in Colombia, not in Rome, this was a big deal. Because there would now be, so if we see, so these are kind of the four objectives that in 1955 CELAM lays out for itself. On the surface, they don't look incredibly risque. They're study the issues facing the Latin American church, coordinate the church's activities, promote and aid Latin American Catholic charitable organizations, and prepare future Salem conferences. As we'll come to see, studying the issues facing the Latin American church actually becomes a big deal because these issues will come to be seen in more social and in some cases political terms that will have a big effect. But actually one of the most immediate effects is this last one, for prepare future Salem conferences, because this is also, so Salem decides that, originally they were supposed to, meet pretty infrequently, mostly when the Vatican wanted to, but Salem decides, no, we're going to meet every single year. We're going to form a whole network of sort of, study committees, and we're going to invite theologians, and we're going to invite all these different kinds of people from all over Latin America to come and meet up. And this was a big deal. Because these were opportunities for theologians, lay people, bishops, priests, nuns to meet each other, exchange ideas, and form these long-lasting networks of communication. And in some of these meetings, these first meetings, in which the ideas that would become key to liberation theology and the progressive Latin American church and the progressive Catholic Church in Latin America, which we'll talk about in a little bit, these key ideas were often in these early study commissions and working groups that were coordinated by Salem. But really on a broader level, these clerics, these religious women, these lay people could now begin to view themselves as distinctly Latin American ecclesial leaders with a common mission. This idea of a common mission would become a big deal. But the big question becomes then, what should this common mission be? Right? What are the most urgent issues facing the Latin American church? Because by the 1950s and the early 60s, just as this sense of Latin American ecclesial identity and mission is growing, Latin American society is undergoing these really intense changes as new social and political movements emerge that are seeking to empower the poor and working classes in Latin America and address this ever-growing inequality between the rich and the poor. Because in the years following World War II, Latin America actually saw a big rise in labor unions, peasant leagues, land reform movements, and other organizations that are demanding social and economic change. And they're calling for what the historian Greg Grandin has called a socialized democracy and a democratized socialism. This idea that social and economic justice needed to form the foundation of any democratic society. And Catholics on the local level become involved in many of these social movements. So in Paraguay, you have priests who become coordinators of what they call these Christian agrarian leagues that provide economic services, cooperative support, mutual aid, education to people in rural Paraguay. In Guatemala, you have Maryknoll missionaries who are promoting this Cursillo movement, in which groups of youth and clergy and religious sisters are coming together and in many instances are discussing their faith and social justice and how they should act to promote both. That's quote. And so in many cases, programs that ecclesiastical leaders had initially introduced in their dioceses with the hope that they would actually act as kind of, conservative forces that would, in many cases, particularly because this is the 1950s and 60s, beginning of the Cold War. People are worried about communism. And so initially, a lot of these programs are, started out as kind of conservative forces, but in a way that's, as I said before, is kind of seen over and over again in the history of the Latin American church. The people on the ground made these organizations into their own. They brought their own ideas and perspectives and experiences to them, and many of these organizations evolved into vehicles for progressive change. This was just one example of that is, Catholic Action, which was present throughout Latin America, but it had particular force in Brazil, Guatemala, and Chile. And it began as this kind of top-down effort to create, they called a lay apostolate that would be sort of a, subordinate extension or helper of the local priest, and in many cases would help kind of purify local religious practices and protect the Catholic faithful from these communist, and at the time they were also worried about Protestant influences. But by the 1960s, members of Catholic Action were starting to be influenced by the See, Judge, Act methodology that was pioneered by Joseph Cardin and the Young Christian Workers Association, in which you saw and you listened to and you experienced the reality of your community. So there's the C. And then you analyze that reality in both a sociological sense and a theological sense, and that's the judge part. And then finally, based on the conclusions of your analysis, you act. So if you analyze a situation and you find it to be unjust, unequal, or immoral, then you must act to remedy that situation. And so unsurprisingly, many Catholic Action members start participating in these new social and political movements that were emerging at the time. And so by the 1960s, you have this kind of, this growing Latin American ecclesial identity and Latin American ecclesial mission, in part fostered by the formation of CELAM. And then you also have these new social and political movements that are bringing attention to and denouncing the inequality and injustice in Latin America. And so Catholics, both lay and clerical, are starting to interact with and become involved in these movements as Catholics. Right? So then enter Vatican II. Vatican II, as I'm sure many of you know, obviously had a huge impact on church life everywhere throughout the Catholic world, but it had a very specific and in some ways unique consequence in Latin America. Some of the most important of which are, again, the consolidation and in some ways the culmination of the formation of this Latin American ecclesial identity that I've been talking about up until this point. Of the 2,860 bishops who attended the council, 601 were from Latin America. And while it can't be said that they had a very large or decisive impact on the council, they did influence a number of the council's documents, particularly those that dealt with social justice, such as Gaudium et Spes. And really it was the lived experience of Vatican II, the experience of working with and speaking with and sort of simply being with fellow Latin American bishops, as well as bishops from other regions of the global south, right? So there's this emerging Latin American identity, but there's also this emerging identity of sort of, the global Catholic Church that is located in the global south, that's coming up, right? And this was hugely important for how Latin Americans saw themselves, as well as for how other Catholics saw them. There is Dom Helder Camara. He was a major player in this group, and Manuel Larraín, I don't have a picture of Chile. He was also a big deal. So, second, by encouraging the church to engage with the modern world and by speaking about social justice and the poor in documents like Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II gave support to many of the Catholics who were already, participating in the social movements that I spoke of before. And it inspired other Catholics who had previously not been involved in these types of movements to then go ahead and get involved. And then collegiality. So by supporting collegiality, Vatican II, which is this idea that the bishops have an authority in and of themselves, right? And so by supporting collegiality, Vatican II gave episcopal conferences such as CELAM and many of the new national bishops' conferences that are starting to be organized in Latin America. It gave them not only sort of, a new importance or a new support, but it also gave them essentially a new mandate, right? Because whereas before an organization like CELAM was thought to be kind of mostly administrative, coordinative, right? Now these types of organizations could become, in a certain sense, voices for their churches, right? And in some cases, prophetic voices for their churches. And as we'll see, this would profoundly impact the way that the Catholic Church interacted with Latin American society. 1965, the council ends, the bishops and theologians go home to their local dioceses and parishes, and now comes the time to apply the Vatican II teachings to Latin American reality. But the question for Latin American Catholics then becomes, what does Vatican II look like in Latin America? And many people are becoming increasingly convinced that the meaning and the mandate of Vatican II really looks different in Latin America than it does in Europe. And some of this difference is captured in this quote that I have up here by Pablo Richard. In Europe, the theological challenge to the church was the structural atheism of modern society and its proclamation of the death of God. In Latin America, the theological challenge was exploitation and underdevelopment, which was causing the death of the human being, right? And so for Latin America, the signs of the times, Vatican II talks about signs of the times, were different, The issues of poverty and economic and social inequality and land concentration and political repression and, death, right? Death of the human being. These were the most immediate and urgent issues that the Catholic Church in Latin America could not afford to ignore. And so this idea began to emerge that the church needed to both address this reality and live in this reality. In short, that the Catholic Church needed to become this Iglesia de los Pobres, a church of the poor that was, of the poor, but also for the poor. So, the culmination of this process of adapting Vatican II to Latin American reality would come in 1968 with the Episcopal Conference of Medellin, which, I don't have the title up there, but the title was The Church in the Present-Day Transformation of Latin America in the Light of the Council. So it was the idea was, the Vatican Council is going to inform how Latin American Catholics approach the relationship to Latin American society as a whole, which, as the title suggests, the transformation of Latin America is in this stage, right, of flux of transformation, of new, social movement. There's lots of change going on, and this is the time that the church really needs to start interacting with the modern world. And that's just what they do. It's really sort of difficult to overstate the importance of Medellin in Latin American church history. If you know anything about Latin American church history, if you know one thing, a lot of times you'll know Medellin, right? You just say Medellin, and this is what it means. And as I said before, there were Latin American Catholics who have been working with the poor and joining social movements before Vatican II, and definitely before Medellin. But with Medellin, the church truly becomes this Iglesia de los Pobres, the church of the poor, in which Catholics were not only permitted, but were really called to confront injustice and enter into solidarity with the oppressed. And so it became, this became part of the church's official program and really part of the church's identity. And part of Medellin's power was the language that the bishops used. And, I'm not sure what people were expecting to read in a final document put out by a regional Episcopal conference, but it probably was not this. So it starts out, the Latin American bishops cannot remain indifferent in the face of the tremendous social injustices existent in Latin America, which keep the majority of our peoples in dismal poverty, and which in many cases becomes inhuman wretchedness. A deafening cry pours from the throats of millions of men and women asking their pastors for a liberation that reaches them from nowhere else. I mean, this language, a deafening cry that's pouring from the throats of millions. I mean, it's this kind of visceral image, right? This prophetic denunciation that kind of refuses to speak about social issues in the abstract, right? And almost kind of reaches off the page to communicate the urgency, the crisis, the scandal of the poverty and inequality and injustice and lack of basic human rights in Latin America. A liberation, and here you can also see the influence of liberation theology, which I won't talk about too much because I hope you're all going to go and listen to an entire lecture about liberation theology. But liberation theology is just coming into being at this time, and its major proponents, I'm including Gustavo Gutierrez, who many of you probably know as the father of liberation theology, served as these periti, or advisors, to the bishops at Medellin, and they really wrote a lot of the documents, drafts themselves. And so in Medellin document, you're not only reading about liberation, but you're also reading about things like institutionalized violence, right? The sinfulness of exploitative structures. This type of sociological analysis that was really central to a lot of liberation theologians' works. So after Medellin, it's really not surprising that we see, this even much greater outpouring of Catholics, of priests, nuns, lay people who are committing themselves to working with and for the poor, to, what they say, go to the people, right? Whether that be in impoverished rural towns in the Central American countryside, or the favelas, the shanty towns in big Brazilian cities. And many become, when they go to these places, they become involved in social justice efforts, whether that be kind of forming agricultural cooperatives, forming unions, fighting for land rights, whatever that's, needed and wanted. And so you have this kind of big, and in some ways very sudden transformation of, what it means to be Catholic in Latin America. But, not all Catholics in Latin America were happy about these developments because, while the image of the Latin American church being projected around the world, and to a certain extent, the image of the Latin American church that we today think about when we think about the 60s and 70s is that of this very progressive Iglesia Popular, right? But within the Latin American church itself, there was actually quite a bit of conflict over this new direction that the church was taking. Almost immediately following the 1968 Medellin conference, there was, to a certain extent, a backlash, right? Particularly amongst conservative members of the Catholic Church who, were really criticizing liberation theology and this new Catholic commitment to social justice, saying it was too political. It ignored Catholic spiritual life, right? It was driven by ideological, rather than theological concerns. There was also this really big concern that, by wanting to form a popular church, these Catholics were actually trying to form a parallel church, right, that was setting itself apart and even perhaps against what they called the official church. And so, these were just a few of the criticisms, but they were intense and they were growing. And to a certain extent, by far the most devastating critique that didn't necessarily always come from within the Latin American church, but it's coming from within Latin American society, right, is that, the accusation that the Catholics who were participating in these new movements were communists. They were Marxists, they were political subversives, that they advocated for violence, or were connected to these, left-wing guerrilla armies that were fighting the state. Because again, think about the time that we're in. This is the 60s, the 70s. This is not only the Cold War, but this is also, when you have the formation of guerrilla armies in Central and South America. And so, while there were certainly some Catholics who did join the guerrillas, there were many liberation theologians who used Marxist tools of analysis as part of their scholarly work. This is definitely true, and some of the criticisms are valid, but the vast majority of the Catholics who are making up local grassroots church movements, we're not communists, we're not advocating for armed struggle. And it's in this context of division, of a kind of divided church, that we are going to turn our attention to Argentina, and to finally Pope Francis, who I haven't mentioned yet in this whole time. And really, actually, not Pope Francis. We're going to look at Father Jorge Bergoglio, right? At the time, he was not Pope Francis yet. And when we are turning to Argentina, it's important to know that kind of Argentina, in many ways, during this period, stands out in Latin America as being kind of on one side of this division, because it was known for its extremely conservative Catholic Church leadership. A church that, was not only very hostile to liberation theology and to Catholic progressive movements, but also it, gained the reputation of a church whose leaders largely supported, either actively or passively, the brutal and violent military dictatorship that came to power in the 1970s. And this is really in stark contrast to other Latin American churches that were faced with violent authoritarian regimes and horrible repression. And they spoke out, forcefully and prophetically against the injustices committed by them. And so, this is particularly, so, this is a time when you have lots of authoritarian regimes coming to power, lots of conflict. You see the Sandinistas, but then you also see a military regime coming to power in Brazil. Pinochet comes to power in Chile. Argentina is in 76, although it starts to have some repression and really state terror. Starts in 1973. In the 80s, you have El Salvador and Oscar Romero. I'm sure many of you know about him. And so, in Brazil, Chile, El Salvador, where the church, not only spoke out and suffered reprisals and attacks, and even in some cases martyrdom, right? Oscar Romero. I think I have a picture, yeah. This here is Dom Helder Câmara, right? Who also spoke out against the military dictatorship in Brazil. And in these countries, they're also setting up institutions, right? Where people who were persecuted could go, to get help, and through which the church could shed light on some of these atrocities being committed, and thus pressure the regime to change. Because in many cases, military regimes were just saying, we don't torture, we don't extrajudicially assassinate people. And in many cases, it was the Latin American church that was going, Brazil, the Commission of Peace and Justice, and even before that, you had the Latin American Catholic Church going investigating during the military regime, coming out with reports saying, look, we have proof that this happened. And to a certain extent, that was a very powerful counter measure to the narrative that's coming out of the military regime, which says torture doesn't happen in Brazil, repression doesn't happen. These are just lies being made up by communists. But when it was coming from the Catholic Church, it had a much different reception. However, the church in Argentina did none of this. It did not create any institutional framework with which to help victims, did not speak out, right? And this was in the face of really one of the most brutal dictatorships in the region. Between 10 and 15,000 people were murdered by the state, another 8,000 jailed and tortured, another 6,000 who had to go into exile. And it's important to note that when the military regime first came to power in 1976, many people welcomed the coup, right? Because they thought that it would bring an end to a period of violence and chaos that had really plagued Argentina since the beginning of the decade, since the beginning of the 1970s, because you had left-wing guerrilla groups committing, really serious acts of terrorism, attacking government institutions, and then you had right-wing paramilitary groups, if anyone's heard of the AAA, supported by Perón. I don't know if anybody's heard of Perón, but this kind of giant of Argentine political life who had returned to the country in 1973 and then was died and replaced by his wife, who intensified, the support for these paramilitary groups that were killing leftists or really, anyone who was progressive. So you did have this very chaotic and violent situation that was going on. And when the military took over, promising peace and order, there was an understandable sigh of relief, right? But that really quickly dissipated because the state, what they called in the proceso de reorganización nacional, the process of national reorganization was underway, and really it was this kind of very horrific campaign of repression against what they called subversives, which turned out to be really anyone who kind of even had the most tangential connection with progressive programs. Anyone who was imagined to have these kind of subversive ideas, inclinations, a lot of people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Scholars really talk about kind of the irrationality and the senselessness of this violence. Federico Finkelstein writes that there was no political logic behind the targeting of people. To most victims, their torture and victimization had no meaning. The crimes of the state made sense only to the perpetrators. So it was really state terror, right? And it's this close relationship, right, that the Catholic Church had with this military regime, and in what was known as kind of this historical relationship between the cross and the sword, the church and the military. And to a certain extent, it's kind of cast a shadow over the history of Pope Francis and his actions as the leader of the Jesuits during this time period. And to a certain extent, some of you may have heard of it, caused some controversy for the Pope, particularly when he was first elected. But, some of this criticism has definitely painted Bergoglio in a light that is not just, that's not fair. It's really important to note from the beginning that Father Bergoglio did not publicly or even really actively support the military regime or the Perón-led repression that was happening in the early 70s. Gustavo Moretti, who's an Argentine Jesuit who teaches at Boston College and who just published actually this really great book on the relationship between the Catholic Church and the military regime in Argentina, he would classify Bergoglio as what he called an institutional Catholic, which was one of three types of Catholicism that he sort of identified that was practiced during the dictatorship. I don't think I have that here. Anyway, so he identifies anti-secular Catholics who were sort of militantly reactionary Catholics who were heavily influenced by what was known as Catholic nationalism, which was this kind of distinct brand of Argentine fascism. And these were the guys who were really on board with the military regime. That's Bishop Tortolo on the side there, standing. They were publicly at all the processions, and they were, defending the military regime, and in many cases even, participating in the torture that was carried out. But then on the other side, you have what Moretti calls committed Catholics, who were really the Catholics who took up Medellin's call to be in solidarity with the poor, right? And they were working for social justice. And to reduce inequality. And these are, the people who experienced lots of persecution during the regime. These two first groups are really the minority of Argentine Catholics. The majority is what you would call institutional Catholics, who, really accepted Vatican II, the need for an engagement with the modern world, but didn't necessarily accept, some of the social and political elements that they believed were incompatible with Catholic lifestyle and with the way in which one should be doing theology, right? And while they really didn't see the church as being one with the state, which is how anti-secularists saw it, they saw the church as having this kind of privileged position from which to gain access to that state. And they felt that this position needed to be protected and guarded. And so, this made them much less willing to confront the military dictatorship because they believed that by protecting the Catholic Church's relationship with the state, they were protecting Catholics, right? And so this is, in many ways, Bergoglio. He welcomed Vatican II, of course, but he didn't welcome some of these changes that I was talking about earlier that were really sweeping across Latin America in the wake of Medellin, particularly those associated with certain strains of liberation theology, particularly ones that used Marxist tools of interpretation and sort of sociological tools as their starting point. And so he's a Jesuit, he's not a bishop, he's not really sort of participating in the diocesan hierarchy, but he is the provincial of the Jesuits, and he sort of becomes defined in many ways by what he was against. And to a certain extent, as I said before, a lot of this is the result of this intense division that's taking place in the Catholic Church, in which there isn't a lot of room for a middle ground, right? So to a certain extent, he is engaging with certain ideas coming out of Medellin, and even liberation theology. And what we'll talk about a little bit towards the end is this idea of Teología del Pueblo, which is kind of an Argentine form of liberation theology that really puts emphasis on popular religiosity, right? And popular piety, and kind of this idea that the religion of the poor is also valuable and that the church can learn from it. So he's engaging with this, and yet, to a certain extent, many of his actions and how people interpreted his stance was determined more by what he was against, and what he rejected as what he saw, an illegitimate expression of Argentine Catholicism. And so he was definitely more moderate than what people perhaps paint him as, but at the time, to take his stance in many ways, people saw as furthering a more radical stance that supported many of the repressive structures that were in place. So the final question becomes, how do we reconcile this Father Bergoglio that we see in Argentina, who spent much of the 70s and 80s fighting against some of these prophetic stances, with the Pope Francis today, whose prophetic denunciations of inequality and unbridled capitalism, environmental degradation, right? These are so central to his identity now. And, it's true. He wasn't as conservative in the past as he's sometimes made out to be. Many people would also argue that he's not as progressive in the present as the media sometimes makes him out to be. But it is difficult, and I think to a certain extent almost impossible, to deny that there has not been a change, right, between then and now in terms of how Pope Francis views the role of the church in society. Some people have sort of posited that perhaps it's kind of a personal conversion, right? At some point, perhaps, that he decided, that he was going to sort of turn away from his conservative past and embrace a more progressive future. That could be true. But rather than think about how Pope Francis changed as an individual, I think to a certain extent it's more useful to think about how the Latin American church changed between then and now, right? Between the 70s and 80s, and particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism. And so there's this kind of, to a certain extent, myth of the death of liberation theology in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And then there's this idea then that Pope Francis is somehow kind of, reaching back into the 60s and 70s and rehabilitating this liberation theology that, had been lost and shunned by the world since then. And that's, really not true. Because really, there's the liberation theology and the commitment to social justice never really went away, right? Because the people at the grassroots remained. And so many of the progressive ecclesial institutions that, were declared dead in the 90s by many kind of scholars and, journalists actually did in fact live on. It's just people weren't taking notice as much, right? It wasn't kind of in vogue. So, this is actually a picture that I took in 2011, and this is an ecclesial-based community, which is sort of, one of the kind of, hallmarks of liberation theology, progressive movements, right? And also one of the things that was definitely declared dead in the 1990s. And this is a picture that I took in 2011, an ecclesial-based community. They were actually giving a conference on faith and ecology, which you can also, this is, before Pope Francis was elected, but this is the Latin American Church taking up the issue of climate change and of the environment. So there's lots of stuff going on at the grassroots. People just weren't necessarily taking too much notice, in part because, and in part in a kind of good way, right? Because there was this sort of breakdown after this fall of the Soviet Union of the kind of ideological categories and divisions that sort of, that I was talking about before, this polarization of the Latin American Catholic Church to a certain extent, was able to ease up once, social projects weren't automatically dubbed as communist, right? And so to a certain extent, there was space that was created for new projects to flourish that perhaps in the past, would have been more controversial that now is sort of accepted as a general expression of a church that is taking seriously the option for the poor, right? But not necessarily a political option. And so this is my final sort of thing, and as I said before, we talk a little bit about popular religiosity and Teología del Pueblo. To a certain extent, groups that previously may have viewed each other perhaps with suspicion, in the 70s and 80s, Teología del Pueblo, which sort of emphasizes popular religiosity, and Teología de la Liberación, which saw itself as more emphasizing social justice, viewed each other a bit suspiciously. Now they're sort of like, oh, we're kind of the same thing, but at the time there was definite some tension there. And yet now, because there's much more of an interaction, you actually have the two that are enriching each other, right? Teología del Pueblo and the emphasis on popular religiosity, which is very central to Pope Francis and then Father Bergoglio's view of what it meant to be a Latin American Catholic Church, right? That is being fully taken up by, social justice activists, right? And people who would perhaps identify themselves more with liberation theology, whereas also, people who identify themselves more with popular piety and religiosity are taking more seriously the call for social action and social justice. So to a certain extent, what you have here is a coming together. And so Pope Francis then really reflects a lot of these categories that I just talked about, in the sense that, he's very much he's seen as making a very strong option for the poor, right? No one would doubt that. He uses the See, Judge, Act methodology. He says that the church should not only sort of be working for the poor, but the church itself should be poor. The media definitely makes a big deal about, Francis's simplicity, and people love that about him, right? And to a certain extent, that's something that we see, that we start seeing in Latin America with the coming of the identity of the Latin American church. Many of the sort of, prophetic progressive bishops, Don Helder Camero, were also famous for, as an archbishop, he wouldn't live in the palace for the archbishop. He'd live in, smaller apartments outside. That was something Don Helder Camero did, right? And so to a certain extent, these things are becoming sort of less indicative of a certain political commitment and more indicative of a common Latin American commitment. So, this is also just Pope Francis, when he talks about climate change, right? This sister, which is the earth, now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her. So here again, you can see Pope Francis kind of taking up this prophetic voice, talking about, el grito de la tierra, right? Which, this idea of, we need to listen to the cries of the poor, the cries of the earth. This is very much Pope Francis as a Latin American pope with a Latin American identity, but who is leading a global church, right? And so, most people would say one of his biggest contributions is kind of decentering the church, right, from Rome and from Europe, and seeing it as a church of the margins, right, where the direction of the church to a certain extent can be found in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, right, places where the church in the past didn't look for direction or future. And I'm going to stop there because I think I've gone over. But I would love to take your questions. Thanks.
Were you saying that the priest shaking the hands of Videla, General Videla, was Bergoglio?
No, and that was actually one of my points, is that the cross and the sword, and to a certain extent, the identification of the Argentine church with the military regime was a small section of the Argentine church. To a certain extent, and why there was still, some, and it's important when the Argentine church, there is, amongst many Catholics, a sort of sense of betrayal, not only from the military, from the bishops and the Catholic leaders who were, sort of publicly and actively supporting the military regime, but of those who sort of passively stood by and did nothing, right? But it's also important not to conflate the two, in the sense that Bergoglio in no way was identified as a supporter of the military regime.
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part question. I found this utterly fascinating, and you began by talking about, well, there was some kind of change with the current pope. And if I follow the logic of your lecture, it might be that the depoliticization of kind of a social agenda, the progressive agenda, and the delinking of that from an immediate identification with communism or Marxism or what have you, might be part of that change.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
For the Pope, that it can become more Franciscan than Marxist or communist.
Yeah. So sorry if I didn't. Yeah. So I think so. When I talk about the change and how I say, well, it's a it could be seen as kind of a lot of people talk about the change in the Pope as kind of a personal conversion, and perhaps there is a bit of that, but to a certain extent, it's also a general change that's happening in which, people like Pope Francis can now, see these movements in a new light, and they can become, because of their depoliticization, they can take on a new meaning, and to a certain extent have a new and perhaps broader impact, not only in Latin America, but in the Universal Church.
And the second part then would be, however, if this change, in my view, must have been very slow, and he must not have been very public about it, because he got elected Pope by a pretty conservative group of bishops. So it was a surprise, it seems to me, at least, is my view, that it was somewhat of a surprise, the turn he took after becoming Pope. So do you know this record between, let's just say, the fall of communism, early part of the 90s, so it takes him 10 years to kind of figure out what's going on. What is his record of kind of public statements between 2000 and his election?
Yeah, so, public statements, I think, is not what people necessarily point to as the indicator of what a lot of people point to is, and to a certain extent because of this, it perhaps may have stayed more hidden, but in some cases it was Bergoglio's actions, right? So, as bishop, and as archbishop, he started things like the Vicaria so in the slums, sort of a permanent, priest presence in the slums that was, there was this idea that, priests should be in the periphery, working, living, things that perhaps to a certain extent are very much reminiscent of, what was happening in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, but that now, to a certain extent, don't necessarily have that connotation, but still, have a very important, both prophetic and practical social justice component. And so to a certain extent, you can definitely see some of the changes in the acts, but there's not necessarily, at least, and to a certain extent, I'm not an authority on, Bergoglio in the 2000s, because that's a little bit recent for a historian. But, there's still stuff that I don't think anybody's really explained in the sense that, I mean, one of the things that most sort of defined Bergoglio as Archbishop was his opposition to gay marriage in Argentina, and he had this very public fight with the Argentine government, and particularly with the Kirchner regime, who he was always kind of at loggerheads with. And so to a certain extent, I mean, in many Argentines' minds, that's what kind of defined Bergoglio, because there was a sort of scandal where he had written to this nun, you know, saying that, you know, homosexuality was like a deep and grave evil or something. I mean, like a pretty harsh statements about homosexuality. So I don't think anybody thought that this was going to be the Pope to say, who am I to judge, and let's not focus on, you know, abortion and gay marriage, let's focus on, you know, these other issues of mercy. And so to a certain extent, there's some stuff that I don't think has been explained yet, unless you think because this fight, you know, with the Archbishop and the government to a certain extent harmed the church a lot. The church lost, gay marriage won, right? And it harmed its credibility to a certain extent because it became very politicized. So, I mean, maybe the conversion in that is just more, you know, learning from past mistakes. Yeah.
I wonder. Thank you. I just wonder if you could say a word about Jorge Bergoglio's leadership in Ceylon and his important role in drafting the Aparecida.
Yeah. So that's actually
he is known for this.
Yeah, that's the last 4
And he
pages.
was not a secret to the College of Cardinals.
Yeah.
They knew him.
Yeah, so
And he-
Aparecida, and this is really interesting because Ceylon is, you know, so we have Rio, we have, which a lot of people don't even really talk about, but Medellin, Puebla, Medellin and Puebla, you know, Medellin we talked about. Puebla is in 1979. I was going to talk about that. That's actually sort of the height of this conflict. A lot of the people there, they called it the Battle of Puebla. You know, the liberation theologians were banned from the conference. They weren't invited, but they came anyway, and they sort of set up shop right across the street, and they secretly passed documents to some of the bishops, and it was this sort of thing. But ever since then, so then Santo Domingo was next, and that, to a certain extent, was kind of considered to be, this was when people were talking about the death of the progressive Latin American church and the death of liberation theology, because this was when the Vatican took a very tight control of the conference, and to a certain extent, people sort of saw this as the end, to a certain extent, of Ceylon. They didn't know if they were going to have another conference. But then you have Aparecida, which in some cases kind of came out of nowhere for a lot of people, and it was led by Jorge Bergoglio. And there's a bunch of stuff about Aparecida that's really, really interesting. And so popular religiosity, well, so first of all, Aparecida, and this is really significant, so, you know, with the kind of exile of liberation theologians from Ceylon, these conferences stopped using the See, Judge, Act methodology, right? Aparecida takes that up again. So you have kind of this new, you know, recognizing of, you know, let's look at Latin American reality, let's look at, you know, some problems, and let's see how the church can face this. You have, you know, the, again, popular religiosity is central. Option for the poor is also big. There's a book, I mean, Gustavo Gutierrez wrote this really great article saying Aparecida is great, and there's a big option for the poor in it. And Sergio Torres, who's this other liberation theologian, and who wrote basically Aparecida is Ceylon, and to a certain extent, sort of the official Latin American church, bringing, he calls Amerindia, which is what many liberation theologians and sort of the progressive Catholic Church started to call themselves, bringing them back into the fold of the church. So, you know, when I talk about, you know, this kind of, to a certain extent, this was the, you know, the realization of this kind of reconciliation of what had been very divided, and with kind of both sides recognizing that, you know, they're stronger together than they are apart. And you have a very, you know, again, if you're seeing, you know, things that used to be anathema to conservative bishops and things that used to be anathema to, you know, progressive members of the church are now able to kind of be seen as enriching one another rather than, you know, it's no longer a zero-sum game, I guess. There's this kind of, so yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, because that was, I had a whole thing about Aparecida, but then all of a sudden I'm like, I've been talking for like an hour and 20 minutes. So yeah, Aparecida is really important, and that's 2007. You know, so not long before he got elected. But again, Aparecida was kind of a surprise. And, you know, it's held at the you know, the national shrine in Brazil of Aparecida, and to a certain extent, it is the Latin American ecclesial identity as very profoundly connected to popular religious identity. And again, many people initially, you know, in the old, you know, in the 70s, saw, you know, if you're gonna focus on and valorize, you know, popular religious identity, you're really only doing that because you don't want to focus on social issues. But as we talked about before, actually, you know, the valorization of popular religiosity in Latin America is a big deal, because for a really long time, it was under attack. It was kind, you know, there was this idea that you needed to purify Latin American religiosity, whereas now there's a totally different approach to it, and they're saying, no, this is actually central to, you know, not only Latin American identity, but to, you know, how we should think of ourselves as a church and how we should interact with society and Catholics and the poor. So sorry, that was super long.
We have time for another question or two.
Yes, I want to ask about the name Francis, because he's a Jesuit, and in Latin America throughout history, this has a connotation of an order, a religious order, who has kind of catered to the upper classes, especially in education. Whereas Francis has kind of a totally different, almost opposed connotation of being with the poor and nature and all of that, and not being in the elite. So I was just wondering about that. To me, it's kind of a contradiction that he picked that name, and I was wondering about that.
Yeah, I mean, some people saw, so Francis and, you know, then Bergoglio had kind of a tortured relationship with Jesuits, and particularly Jesuits in Latin America, in part. So lots of Jesuits in Argentina accuse Pope Francis of being sort of anti-intellectual, which for a Jesuit is like the worst thing that you can be. And so there's, I think some might read it as sort of as meaningful in the sense of him, you know, moving away a little bit from his Jesuit identity, but he himself says that that's not true at all. That in his heart he's very much a Jesuit pope. So, I mean, I don't necessarily see it as a contradiction. I see, you know, I see it as, when you look at, you know, wanting to make so much about Pope Francis is, you know, himself as the image of what the church should be like, right? You know, not only Catholics, but what the church should be like, you know, simple and humble and merciful and, you know, and poor, you know, both in the way he dresses and, you know, anyway, and so Francis embodies a lot of this, and so I think that it's a natural choice for him, and maybe to a certain extent indicates a little bit of how he was a different kind of Jesuit, and maybe some of the conflicts that he had.
our last question.
Yes. Do you, looking ahead at some of the scenario that you presented, do you see some influences that might come from the south to the north and from the north to the south? You mentioned the rights of gay people, and also one could add the rights of women in the church, and then from the south, maybe a consciousness of rights for the poor, because in the United States we're living in a highly stratified society with the growing wealth gap, and workers' rights are being trampled in the States right now. So how do you see the exchanges between North and South in some of these ideas?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think definitely, you know, one of the hallmarks of Pope Francis's, you know, papacy is this idea of, you know, not only bringing the South to the North, but bringing the periphery to the center, and, you know, bringing the South into not only, you know, what can the North learn from this, but what as a universal church can we learn from this? To a certain extent, you know, some of the things from the North are some of the issues that have been, to a certain extent, you know, marginalized by Pope Francis. You know, he's already kind of said that he doesn't really want to, you know, have the church focus too much on gay marriage, abortion. He also doesn't talk about women a lot. And when he does, people are many times critical of how he talks about women. So, yeah, that is not clear yet, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.